Hello, welcome to Regional Divisions in the Gilded Age. We're going to look at why and where was America so divided. So this is the first one of these that we're going to do. We're going to see how they go. If you've got any feedback, that'd be great. So this map is America in 1880. Take a couple of seconds to think about what you think it represents. Read the caption at the bottom, pause the video, and then see if it matches up with what I think. So this is a map of the amount of railroad that was laid down in 1880 in a 10-year period, upwards of 40,000 miles, bringing the total network to 93,500 miles. And you can see where it's concentrated. The north of America is the powerhouse, the industrial place. In the south, less so, moving through to the west, even less. Again, with this map, take a few minutes to think about it. And again, this map really does tell us how divided the north and the east was to the south and the west. And we're going to see whether these divisions really did mean that there was going to be social unrest. Just to introduce the topic, remember the Gilded Age is the time between 1870s and the 1890s. On the surface, the US population grew, the economy grew, but there was lots of political corruption, many misdealings of big businesses, and the wealthy people lived much more fancy lives in comparison to our rural counterparts. The name comes from the book by Mark Twain. The power and the wealth of the Gilded Age was built on corruption and the exploitation of working classes. America was a nation divided by class, race and gender, a fire fueled by mass immigration. We're going to decide how far we agree with this statement today. We're going to start with urbanization in the north and the east. So effects of industrialization, urbanization and shifts in population were really notable in the north and the east, New York, Chicago, etc. New York's population doubled from 1860 to 1890. Chicago grew tenfold, 100,000 to a million. Big business had its greatest influence over the north and the east. And really, when we talk about political corruption, that's where the majority of it occurs, and that's where a lot of the politicians change hands. We're going to look at whether that does affect social tensions. This image highlights the north and the east. One particular example is the railroads. It's a really useful example to evidence the social unrest that took place. So the Great Railroad Strike of July 1877 started in Baltimore as a very small movement in relation to some misdealings and cuts in wages, and it quickly grew. It went through Ohio, Maryland, Pennsylvania and Pittsburgh, where 40 people lost their lives in clashes with the National Guard. Now the National Guard was deployed to try and stop the workers from protesting, to try and keep it peaceful, but it eventually led to 40 dead. It then spread also to Chicago and St. Louis before President Hayes had to step in, and he sent thousands of federal troops to restore the order. So I don't think there's any better example to sort of show and evidence the regional divisions, that even in the north and the east, where it was supposed to be industrialized, urbanized and economically superior, there were still social divisions. So perhaps that is agreeing with the statement to begin with. Further social unrest in the north and the east: Irish Protestants versus Irish Catholics in New York in the 1870s and the 1871s. Now each year the Protestants hold an Orange March, and there was the Orange Riots in 1870 on July the 12th. 8 people were killed, and it's a good example of growing gang warfare that is going to be typical of America when we look later on in the course. There were powerful Irish gangs. They dominated New York, but they were also dominating places like Chicago, and then there were also the beginnings of the effects of immigration. For instance, the Italian mafia, the Jewish mafia and Polish organised crime syndicates starting to appear. It's not to the same extent that it will be in the 1920s and onwards, but it's starting to bubble up. Now, obvious tensions are in the New South. After Reconstruction, or the attempts at reconstruction, the New South is born. However, it's very much the same as the Old South. This image shows the effects of the Jim Crow trailer, and you can see the South in the picture, how barren it is, how agricultural it is. There was discontent and disillusionment on both sides. There were growing social unrest between middle-class white people and working-class white people, and there was the same discontent and the same disillusionment among black African Americans. They were still trying to decide on how do they get their goals. Is it moderation or is it radical violence? They were using terms like the Yankees, carpetbaggers, scalawags. Yankees was a derogatory term used to describe the Northerners. Carpetbaggers was a term of abuse hurled at Northern merchants and people that switched sides. They were accused of robbing and defeating the South. Scalawags, again, was something hurled at Southerners who collaborated with Northerners to try and enrich themselves. So just as in the North, the South is still suffering from these big social divisions. African Americans we will look at separately as well, and their struggles in this period. Lastly, we're going to talk about the Wild West. So this image shows you the plains of the Wild West, how isolated it was, how empty it was, and really Native Americans are at its core. By 1890, really, the West had been rapidly settled. There had been years and years of westward expansion. That was through wars, through treaties with the Native Americans, through government policies, through the US Army, and an organisation called the Bureau of Indian Affairs that we will look at in more detail later on in the course as well. Now, it wasn't just between Native Americans and Americans that this social tension was evident. It's also between farmers, ranchers, miners, hunters, small businesses as well that we'll look at. One piece of evidence for the Wild West being an area of social tension is gold prospecting. Now, there had been a treaty between America and the Native Americans to stop violent unrest. That was completely abandoned when gold diggers poured into the Black Hills of the Dakotas in 1874. It broke the treaty and it caused tensions again to erupt between Native Americans and Americans. However, life was very transient in this period. It meant it rapidly changed. It had been quickly settled, but really by 1883 the Wild West was tamed, and so much so that it was starting to be parodied. There was a touring company called Buffalo Bill that really did satire the West. Still though, for Americans it held a certain something, and they still saw it as the Wild West, where they could seek the American dream, they could set up their own homesteads, they could open up their own ranch, they could open up their small farms. But it is starting to end. And lastly, we're going to talk about Native Americans. White Americans versus the Indians. Really, by 1890, as we've already said, the West has been captured, Indian life has gone. Their open spaces are now fenced, their tribal lands are now given out to individuals. Native Americans were confined to very small reservations, and that was the way their life stayed until FDR. They were marginalised, they were on the outside of American society, and their rights weren't even considered really until FDR, as we've said. There were protest movements as well that evidence the social unrest that's occurring in this period. For instance, white versus Indians, farmers and pioneers were pushed aside by big agriculture, by large ranching companies and mining companies. And farmers and pioneers, these people that had settled the West earlier, were now struggling and running into debt. And a group called the Granger Movement in 1867 and later the Alliance Movement in 1870 grew to try and oppose these huge changes. There was a cooperative movement to help farmers with loans, is the Granger Movement in 1867. That meant these small farmers would cooperate with each other to try and create a larger organisation similar to a union, and to try and get better things for themselves, such as loans, They were particularly focused on the railroad company. If we go back to that very first image, you can see how the railroads are expanding into the west, and wherever they set up, it would create towns, it would create jobs, but it would very quickly go, and it was a cause of tension in this period. Support for the Granger movement peaked in 1880 before it switched to the Alliance movement. The Alliance movement was somewhat more successful. It set up it had candidates that actually stood for the election, so a good example of the type of protest that's occurring in this period. And that's it for the first example podcast. Let me know what you think. Thank you very much.